Welcome to the Never Too Early Fantasy Podcast, where it is never too early for fantasy football. My name is Jeff.
And I'm Alex.
We are rolling now. Thank you, folks, that took time to listen, download, and liking last week's episode. You can find us on Spotify, YouTube, TikTok, Twitter with the handle N2EFantasy. So how's it going today, Alex?
It's going well. We've got a lot of fantasy free agent news that we're going to cover today. So I'm excited to go over these items. Some of them kind of small. Some of them might have some big impacts.
Absolutely. And it's good to kind of track where all the players go to in the off season, just so you don't show up to the fantasy draft and say player X is on his old team, because everyone's going to look at you slightly weird if you do that.
All right. So let's go ahead and look at the news from around the league. So we have our weekly transactions. Let's start with the Chargers. Speaking of one of those re-signing cases, we have Donald Parham re-signs with the Chargers. Is he still the number 2 to Everett? Is he going to take over the 1 spot? What do you feel about this, Jeff?
So there was some rumblings earlier in the offseason that the Chargers were going to look to upgrade their tight end position. And it is something they may do. Obviously, the free agent market, as we're going to talk about, has dried up mostly with the tight end market. And Parham was a restricted free agent with the Chargers that they did let go, and they brought him back at a reduced rate. So it does seem like they want him, but they didn't want him at his rate of a restricted free agent. So what that means is he is going to enter the number 2 right now, and we need to be on the lookout for them drafting a first or second round tight end in this year's draft. And right now is March 23rd, and what that means is the draft is right around the corner. Like, we are 5 weeks away from the NFL draft from tonight. So that'll be one of the more interesting things to watch on Thursday and Friday of draft week, is to see if the Chargers do pick up that new rookie tight end. I do think that Everett, though, might be on his way out at some point, just because there was a couple of games last year where he made a few mistakes that cost them games. The one that comes to mind is that Chiefs game, where he was tired. He wanted to be pulled from the game, but they're running a hurry-up offense, and he halfway did his route, which ended up in a pick 6 from Herbert, because he was expecting Everett to be in a place where Herbert was. And I just think that they could be ready to move on from Everett, and Herbert needs a big body target to throw to that isn't named Mike Williams, because Mike Williams, we know, only plays half the games. What about you? What do you think that Parham brings to the roster? And obviously he's going to stick around for this year, but probably not long term also.
Yeah, I think it's just roster depth that's familiar with the offense. He doesn't really stand out to me as like a top-end kind of starter or anything like that. So I think he's just a backup option that's just familiar.
Yeah, and they also have third-year Trey McKitty as well on their roster. So, I mean, that's another name to look out for.
He could develop. They could draft someone, like you said. I don't know, but they could easily go wide receiver as well. So they'll probably target a tight end or wide receiver pretty high in the draft. But to me, this is the depth signing or re-signing in this case. But in that same division, we have another team that signed 2 tight ends. So O.J. Howard and Austin Hooper both signed with the Raiders. Jeff, how do you feel about them signing 2 different tight ends? And which one do you think is the one to own, or do we avoid this situation?
So this is a void for me. Hooper was one of the people that I thought were going to have good season last year with the Titans, and he did not at least until the end of the season after I had already given up on him. Howard did start the year really hot with the Texans last year, but then he wasn't heard of at all after that. And he really hasn't been the same tight end since the Achilles tear, and he's a really athletic tight end. So being a Texans fan, what is your thoughts on Howard and a little bit older Hooper?
Well, I think Howard has always been the type of tight end that's like, he's large, he's athletic, the sky's the limit, but he's never put that product on the field. So I think he's kind of a low-end flyer, especially for the Raiders. But in that system, if McDaniels is running like the Patriot-style system, they use tight ends. They use 2 tight ends. They might use a Howard in a very budget version of Hernandez, and they might use Hooper in a discount version of Gronkowski, but in accordance with the wide receivers that they already have. So they might provide more than we expect, but I would just go very low expectations on both of these guys and maybe draft them in a deep league as a backup tight end just in case one of them blows up. But it's one of these situations, it's probably better for the real NFL teams rather than fantasy teams.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Raiders have a ton of pass catchers this year, and Jimmy Garoppolo hasn't been known to really support more than one fantasy option at a time. So, and that screams Davante Adams, and everyone else goes to the wayside to me because I don't think that Davante Adams is going to go to the wayside. I can't see a universe where they don't make Jimmy force Adams the ball because that worked a lot last year, and I could see it working a lot again this year. And speaking of pass catchers that the Raiders have brought into the team, first, Keelan Cole re-signed with the Raiders. He's not much fantasy value, but it's worth mentioning the signing. He had some valuable depth in that wide receiver core. And then also want to send out the best wishes and thoughts to Foster Moreau, the Raiders tight end, free agent tight end now that is undergoing treatment for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And just want to point that out. And he's going to take a year off from football at this point.
Yeah, you don't want to hear that about anybody. That's pretty sad. We wish him the best.
Absolutely. Speaking of other former Raiders pass catchers, we have Mac Hollins signing with the Atlanta Falcons. Is he currently the number 2 wide receiver in Atlanta? And was 2022 his peak year? Or do you expect a lot of the same from 2023?
I think he slides in as a number 3 or number 4 wide receiver ultimately. With Atlanta the way they are now, he's probably the number 2 penciled in at that spot. We don't know what they're going to do with the draft. We don't know if they're going to go after anyone that potentially gets cut. He's kind of the number 2 wide receiver, but he's not exactly the number 2 receiving option because they do have Pitts there as well. So Pitts and London both. Jeff, do you agree with that, or do you think he's going to have a good year?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think last year was really impressive what he did with the Raiders, though, kind of coming out of nowhere after a pretty wasteland career. And I think that is something to watch because if Atlanta does not add another wide receiver, he could be the 3rd pass catching weapon behind, as you mentioned, London and Pitts. So it's interesting to watch, but with Desmond Ridder under center, it may be moot because we don't know what Desmond Ridder is at this point. If he's what he showed last year, I'm not hopeful. and hopefully he can improve because I do root for more interesting, better football.
Yeah. We don't even know if Ritter is going to end up being the guy starting week 1. There's other potential moves they could make. They could draft a new quarterback. They could potentially go after Lamar Jackson at some point. We don't know. But right now, it's Ritter, and they're trying to add onto that team. But a former Falcon, Marcus Mariota, is signing with Philly. So to me, it seems to be the best landing spot. We've talked about this before. It certainly fits for his skill set. Jeff, do you think that it's a wise move? Do you think it was too much money? What do you think about Mariota?
So I think he's the perfect backup to Hurts because at the end of the day, like if your star quarterback goes down, you do want a quarterback that can fill right in without having to change the offense. And I do believe that Marcus Mariota can do that. Obviously, this is going to be a 1-year deal, and then we'll see. But this could be a long-term clipboard holder for Jalen Hurts. Do you see it that way as well?
It could be. It could just be for the year. If he does well there, then potentially they can keep him longer. To me, it's very similar to when the Eagles had Michael Vick and they brought in Vince Young, also another former Titans player, to be the backup. They did the same kind of mobile quarterback with the mobile quarterback backup. They've done it before, and I think Mariota at this point in his career brings more to the table than what Vince Young did at that point in his career. So Mariota might help them get through a couple games. If Hurst misses time, I don't think Mariota is someone who can help them win in the playoffs if they needed to use him there, though.
Right. That was that dream team Philly, right?
Yeah, this is dream team number 2, right?
Kind of. I don't feel like they have that same swagger, and I don't feel like they have that same arrogance to them that they did back then. And they're not calling themselves a dream team.
Yeah, I think they've learned their lesson from their predecessors.
I would hope so. So moving forward to a more fantasy relevant topic, the Carolina Panthers have replaced DJ Moore, some of his pass catching targets, with Adam Thielen. As discussed last week, this is a great spot for Adam Thielen as there are targets available. What would you say his fantasy ceiling is this year?
That is a good point, because that would depend on if they like him as their top receiving option or if they're going to somehow bring in another receiver into this group. So I would say ceiling-wise, I would probably say about maybe 1,000 yards at most. Probably somewhere between 800 to 1,000 receiving yards. I don't know about touchdowns. I think he's going to be there to be a veteran mentor, someone who can get the tough catches on first down, maybe a little bit of a possession guy for them. I don't know if he has the athleticism to stretch the field. He's someone who definitely will soak up some targets and help some of the younger players like Terrence Marshall Jr. to maybe develop a little bit more. What do you think about it? I know you're a Panthers fan, always wearing that hoodie. Do you like this, and where do you see him stacking up on your Panthers?
So I see him no better than a flex play. Depending on your league, that could be a wide receiver 3 or a flex play. I see him approximately catching 70 balls for 800 yards, and he is a touchdown machine, so I could see him grab 9 touchdowns, especially from a team that's inexperienced and a team that's going to be devoid of talent and pass catching options. So I could see that being his ceiling. I mean, that's a pretty good ceiling for a rookie quarterback, because we're going to assume a rookie quarterback is going to come in and start week 1. Is that veteran presence that's really going to help that rookie quarterback take their first couple of steps into the NFL. And it does sound like it is a 2-year contract. So what that means to me is that this rookie is going to have Thielen for the first 2 years of that deal. And that'll probably be Thielen's last 2 years in the NFL. He's currently 32. He'll be 33 before the season starts. So I do believe those will be his last 2 seasons in the NFL. But I think it's a good way to like get a quarterback's feet wet. And we both can agree Thielen's not like your normal wide receiver that the wheels are just going to fall off, because he's just not that type of receiver that's like a wheels guy. He's more of like a possession wide receiver, and we know those guys hang on a little bit longer than your burners and such, and the people that have multiple injuries throughout their career. And Thielen, well, it seems like he does get injured every other play. It does seem like he only misses a play or two, and he's right back out on the field. So
yeah,
he's a tough guy as well. So I think that's important to look at. I would be remiss not to mention one of your favorite players in all of the NFL in Ronald Jones, and he has signed to be the primary backup to Pollard. Well, I guess the first question is, do you believe that he's the primary backup to Pollard, or do you think one of the young guys that they used last year is? And then what is his value as a backup? Is it 50% of Zeke? Is it 25% of Zeke? Is it 75% of Zeke? What do you think?
The prince that was promised has risen again. No, I don't. I've always liked Ronald Jones's potential. He had a really good athletic score as a prospect, and athletically he comped to Leonard Fournette. I don't think he got the same production in college, and there's just sometimes they can't mentally get it. I don't know what it is that's holding him back from succeeding in the NFL. He doesn't have a lot of tread on his tires. I think he's a nice backup for Dallas to have, especially if Dallas improves their offensive line. And if Pollard gets hurt, which he's coming off of a broken leg, Ronald Jones could potentially be one of the backups. He has to win that camp battle. They're going to bring in more running backs. So I don't know if he can ultimately win, but if he does somehow win the backup role, or he wins the starting role for whatever reason, he could potentially be good, but I'm keeping the odds very low for that. I've learned my lesson from when he was the backup with the Chiefs.
Come on, you're not allowed to learn your lesson. You are going to rely very heavily on him, and I do think it's worth mentioning that Pollard did sign his franchise tender today. So what this means is if the Cowboys sign or draft a running back like Bijan Robinson, that they can't just pull the franchise tag tender on Pollard. He's locked into that 1 year, fully guaranteed contract now. He doesn't have to worry about the Cowboys pulling the rug out from him. And if they did pull the rug out from him, we do see a lot of what these running backs are getting, and we'll get to some of those running back contracts later. But we do see that they're signing from $3 to $4 million a year versus like the 10 that you're getting on the franchise tag tender. So it's a considerable difference. But speaking of the Cowboys, they made a trade for your Texans, Brandon Cooks. So Dallas gets a new receiver to pair with an emerging CeeDee Lamb, and it should take some of the coverage away from Lamb. Where are you taking Cooks? Do you think that he is the true number 2 Dallas has been looking for? And what's your overall feeling about Cooks now that you've traded him away?
I'm not happy with the compensation the Texans got back. I've come to terms with the fact that that was probably unavoidable, and they might not have been able to get more than that. I'm just disappointed by it. I was hoping for a third, maybe settle for a fourth, but got less than that with a fifth and a sixth. He's still got something left in the tank. It's somewhat similar to Adam Thielen, where he's, at this point, I think he's more of a possession guy than the field stretcher and the electric run after the catch guy he used to be. I don't think he has that in him anymore. Lamb is the more athletic receiver. He's the main guy. I think by default, Brandon Cooks is the number 2. I think Gallup comes in as well. So maybe Gallup, if Gallup is healthier this year, might have more of a presence. So I don't know where to slide Brandon Cooks in, but I would say halfway between his 2022 stats and his previous year's stats, probably somewhere in that range. Because I think last year was a little low for him, but I don't know if he'll get 1,000 yards or more this year.
Brandon Cooks to be a wide receiver 3. Kind of what that looks like is I think that does bump Gallup up, because I do think Gallup is a better wide receiver 3 on a team than being the second receiving option, because he definitely thrived when it was Lamb, Cooper, and Gallup, and that's kind of what led to the big contract that he got last year. I do think that Cooks will be slightly overvalued in fantasy drafts this year because he is going to Dallas, and we do know Dallas players, especially when you make big splash trades like this, they do tend to get slightly overdrafted, and that might cause me to stay away from him in fantasy drafts. But obviously at the right cost, like if we're talking like 7th, 8th round, I'm definitely taking Brandon Cooks every step of the way. And we're going to have to watch his ADP along the way, especially after the rookies are drafted and they have their teams. And we're just going to have to keep an eye on it. But I do think that him and Lamb help each other out with coverage. And I do think that both Lamb and Cooks could see a bump from last year just because of that.
So if Brandon Cooks goes in the 4th through 6th rounds, I am not touching him. That's too high. But if he's 8, 9, 10, or 11, somewhere in that range, I'm going to have a flyer throw at him. Like I'm going to try give him a chance, because the potential that he exceeds that is pretty good. However, the potential that he only puts up 700 yards is also good. So if he's going 4th round, 5th round, you just busted. Like you just threw away a pick, a very crucial pick. So I wouldn't bite him too high. So we definitely have to wait and see where he settles in fantasy drafts.
So as of right now, consensus expert ranks have him at pick 98, which is wide receiver 42. We're going to see next week how much this trade to Dallas has impacted the movement of Cooks. We're going to see if he's going to fly up boards. If he stays around pick 98, I'm taking him almost every single time there, because that is a bargain area for Brandon Cooks. So speaking of the Texans and the Cowboys, the Texans have signed tight end Dalton Schultz. I think that was a really good signing by the Texans. It's just really a 1-year deal worth less than $7 million. It's kind of surprising there was a dry market for Schultz, who had his best games with Dak, but also Dak had his best games with Schultz as well. What are your thoughts on kind of the deal that the Texans were able to get in this, and where do you kind of slot Schultz going into this year?
It's a good get for the Texans. They haven't had a good tight end since they had Owen Daniels basically a decade ago or more. They've tried to draft multiple tight ends, and none of them have panned out. Schultz is a really good tight end for them. Their system is going to employ a receiving tight end a lot more. I think the value he contributes to the Texans as a tight end is about the same or better than the value that Brandon Cooks brings to the Cowboys, in my opinion. The Texans also have a bunch of young wide receivers that they need to see if they're any good. So you got Nico Collins, and then you've got Mechie coming back, hopefully healthy. They might go after They might go after another wide receiver in this draft. And they also signed Robert Woods, who maybe doesn't provide the same level that Brandon Cooks provided, but will probably fill a lot of that void. And especially having extra time recovering from his injury, he should be better with the Texans than he was with the Titans. That's not really saying much, but that's what the Texans are hoping anyway. I'm surprised to see the Texans make good moves. That makes me a little bit happy. And speaking of the good moves that the Texans are making, they also signed Devin Singletary, formerly from the Bills, who I think is going to be a great compliment to Pierce. How do you feel about Schultz, and then how do you feel about Singletary as well for the Texans?
So Schultz is going to be a really good receiving option for the Texans. We're just going to see who his quarterback is, and then I think I'll be a little bit interested to see how he performs without Dak. Just kind of looking at the games with Dak and without Dak last year. So it'll just be something to monitor. It just could be a pure coincidence, or it could be that Cooper Rush, was it Cooper Rush last year? Didn't have quite the chemistry with Dalton Schultz. But moving on to Devin Singletary, man, I like the signing for the Texans. This is a really, really, really good football move. However, I feel like this is a fantasy terrible move because it's going to take a percentage of snaps away from Pierce. And I don't know where this leaves Pierce's fantasy value. Like, I have him under 1,000 rushing yards now, which he was on pace last year before he was injured to get over 1,000 rushing yards, which actually is not as easy as it sounds in the NFL anymore. I do think that Singletary takes away touches. I do think that touches are both rushes and passes. And obviously we know passes are typically more valuable than rushes because you're typically passed into open space. And I could see Singletary becoming the team's primary third down back, and that's just not a good fantasy look for Pierce at all. What are your thoughts as a Texans fan where Singletary fits in? And how do you feel about the outlook for him and Pierce going forward?
Well, I think going into it, if both backs are healthy, Pierce is the number one back. Singletary will spell him and fill in on third downs and passing downs. But ultimately, this could end up being a David Montgomery, Khalil Herbert situation where if both of them are healthy, they eat into each other's touches, and then it's which back do you want to own? I know Khalil Herbert went a lot later in drafts and was performing for a lot of fantasy owners up until the point that he got hurt. Devin Singletary's already been that kind of guy with the Bills where people overlook him. And if you go a zero running back strategy and take him, he overperforms his draft position, which that's worked for me just this last year. I used him in one of my leagues. I think it's a savvy, like you said, it's a very savvy, real NFL move for the Texans. And I think it could still work for fantasy. It just depends on where you're drafting these two guys. Like, you don't want to draft Pierce too early now. He still has the same sky-high upside, but you don't want to draft him too early because you know, at least at the beginning of the year, Singletary is going to eat into his touches.
You almost want one healthy at a time, and that's really sad to say it that way. But you almost want to know who the guy is going into that week.
I think Pierce is still the guy. I really do, but I think it's going to be a almost even timeshare, which is not great, but where a lot of teams are going now these days.
Sad state of affairs. Moving on from the Texans, Mr. Jordan Akins has moved on from the Texans and signed with the Cleveland Browns. Is he going to be fantasy relevant this year? Is he the second or third tight end option? Because I know they have Bryant and Njoku there. Njoku's the no doubt about it starter. Where do you kind of slot in Akins? Is he like a safety blanket for Deshaun? Have they played together before?
I think he's a decent tight end. He's always had the possibility to develop into a good tight end. That's why he was used in the Texans offense a lot. I don't think David Njoku is that intimidating. He hasn't gone over 600 passing yards. He hasn't caught 60 passes or more. So it's not like Njoku is all world or unbeatable for that spot. I just don't think tight end in that Cleveland system is as utilized as people think it is. I think it's going to be mostly in the wide receiver realm that you get the stats. I don't think any of them are worth using in fantasy, in my opinion, or you might have to wait through preseason to see how it shakes out. I think Njoku is one of those players that has teased fantasy owners for several years now and never really put up the stats.
Yeah, I got Njoku a high-end tight end 2 going into the season as of right now. So not usable, but a bench player. You got to definitely use a bench spot for a guy like that, just in case he catches fire. Because we'll be honest, this is the best quarterback that he's played with on a consistent basis because he only had 6 games with Watson last year. So we're going to see what that translates into a full season. And I'll be really interested to see what that looks like. I'm a little disappointed that Akins went to a team that already had 2 kind of established tight ends, only because I did think that he offered a decent fantasy value last year. I mean, he finished tight end 17, which for a guy that a lot of folks really probably don't know, he finished quite high in the tight end list last year, and I would have liked to see him go to a team that had more opportunity. And obviously, we all know that there's teams like the Bengals and the Chargers that are looking for tight ends, that are looking for tight end upgrades, and maybe that would have been a better spot for him. But he did play with Deshaun in Houston, and he's reuniting. I think he signed to reunite with him. So I do think that he feels like there's some chemistry there with Deshaun. So maybe he feels like this is the best place to put up stats and have a little bit of fun.
Maybe. They did overlap for a couple of years because he was in Houston for 5 years. So he definitely played with him. I don't know. He hasn't ever gone over 500 yards, and his best year was without Deshaun. So I don't know if going to Deshaun is a better move.
No, but speaking of going to Deshaun, the Cleveland Browns have traded for Elijah Moore from the New York Jets. The trade was Elijah Moore and a 3rd-round pick for a 2nd-round pick. So the Jets move up around. The Jets move up around, and the Cleveland moves down around to get to the receiver to kind of pair with Amari Cooper. That obviously hurts the draft stock this upcoming year. Donovan Peoples-Jones, maybe even David Bell, the 2nd-year wide receiver there. Because I do feel like, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I do feel like Elijah Moore slides into the number 2 slot here in Cleveland right off of day 1. And he actually becomes a pretty valuable fantasy asset for Deshaun Watson and the Cleveland Browns. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it was a pretty cheap trade on Cleveland's part, so they didn't really have to give up much. Moore is talented, but he's never shown up on the field, just like a lot of the players that we've talked about so far. So it's a nice, low-risk move for Cleveland. He's clearly the number 2 for now. I don't know if they're going to make any other moves this offseason, but as of this moment, I think he's the number 2 option. I don't think the other 2 guys are anything to write home about either. Just Amari Cooper that's been getting a lot of the stats and is still going to be the primary wide receiver. But it's a good move for the Browns. I think he's going to end up being the number 3 Elijah Moore. They're probably going to target somebody else soon, either via trade or in the draft. But I think these are good depth and quality moves for the Browns.
Totally agree with that. So Elijah Moore goes from the Jets, where he did request a trade the year before. The Jets have replaced Elijah Moore with Mecole Hardman, who signed with the Jets on a 1-year deal the same day of the Moore trade. Where does Mecole fit into the crowded Jets wide receiver room? And I guess it's time to mention, but there is strong rumors that OBJ might be signing with the Jets as well. So that wide receiver room, which if OBJ signs, we can definitely kiss Corey Davis goodbye. But that wide receiver room is still packed with or without Corey Davis.
Yeah, I think Mecole Hardman is the only super speedy receiver the Jets have. So that's one reason why they probably targeted him. So that makes sense to me. He fits a certain role and certain skill set that they didn't have on their roster. You've already mentioned that I think Corey Davis and I think Mims are very expendable, so they could be traded or cut, especially if they bring in OBJ. OBJ is more of a possession, potentially could be the number one guy if he signs there. You've pointed out several times to me how much Rodgers loves throwing to veterans. Supposedly, Rodgers is pretty familiar with OBJ. They probably played in the Pro Bowl together. They're on relatively friendly terms. So Rodgers would love to have OBJ there. I'm sure it would be the OBJ show featuring Lazard, probably, which would be a downgrade for Wilson and for the rest of the wide receivers on that roster. Do you think Hardman and OBJ fit that roster? Where do you think they would slide in compared to the other wide receivers? What do you think happens to some of these wide receivers? What do you think about this Jets wide receiver group?
I think if OBJ signs with the Jets, exactly what you had said, that OBJ is going to be their wide receiver one, which means that he's going to get the most targets. Does not mean he's going to be the most productive. It doesn't mean any of that, but I do believe the target share for him will be number one on the team. This is assuming a lot of things. So this is assuming Rodgers to the Jets. This is assuming OBJ to the Jets. This is assuming Davis is cut. The number two wide receiver is slightly up for debate, but we do know that Garrett Wilson's probably the most talented wide receiver out of all of them here. So I'm going to give him a slight edge at number two just because he's the most talented wide receiver here. But we do know Rodgers' history with Allen Lazard, so I would not be shocked if Allen Lazard was number two in target shares on the team. And kind of interesting is Hardman, where he fits into this, because I could see him being a 1-2 shot down the field guy. If he turns into a 1-2 shot down the field guy and a kick returner, $6.5 million is a heck of a payday for that. I could see him being Rodgers' like MVS type of player. I know they're not the exact same, and I know they actually played on the same team last year, but that's kind of where I see that is I think I would have OBJ leading the target pie, and then I would have probably Garrett Wilson, and then I would have Lazard, and then I would have maybe even Breece Hall after. So like this target pie gets small really quickly when you start adding in running backs and tight ends, because they have Conklin and Uzoma, and they have Michael Carter, and they're rumored to get Zeke. Like, I just don't know where the yards and targets go on this team. It's kind of funny because I think Rodgers almost becomes a must draft with that much talent, but all of the weapons become you probably can pass on them because there's just not enough of the target pie.
Well, it's very interesting because it's like, is Rodgers going to throw for 3,800 yards? Is he going to throw for 4,200, 45? Is he going to have a Tom Brady year where he throws for 5,000 yards? I don't know what's going to happen with that team. So I don't know how much to assign to all these players. But if they sign OBJ, then OBJ is going to get a decent amount. We hope that they give Garrett Wilson the ball a lot because he is young and very, very talented. But you've pointed out to me several times how much Rodgers loves his veteran players, and he has that history with Lazard, so Lazard's going to get targets. But you've only encountered one exception to that, and that was Randall Cobb in his second year, put up big stats with Aaron Rodgers. But other than that, whether it's the type of receivers they were drafting at Green Bay, or whether it's a veteran thing, or whether it's a playbook thing, Rodgers has not really passed to any other young receivers in high quantities and high volume. So it's going to be interesting. We still have yet to see how this receiving group even looks, let alone try to project for them. So I'm sure there's going to be a few cuts or a few trades coming, as well as additions. Just leave everything penciled in for now.
Right. And I'm not so sure that moving on from Braxton Berrios was a good idea for the Jets, because I know they cut him about a week and a half ago. I'm not sure the wide receivers they're bringing in are really an upgrade on him or the position that he played, because he was kind of a gadget guy. He's definitely more like a slot receiver gadget guy. He is signed with the Miami Dolphins, which is oddly like a really good compliment to Hill and Waddle. And at the very least, that's more of like a handcuff. Like if they were to go out, I just feel like he's a guy that won't be drafted in fantasy drafts this year, but he's a guy that a lot of teams are going to be running to the waiver wire if Tyreek goes down or Waddle goes down to try to scoop him off the waiver wire, because I do think that passing offense is just as potent as it was last year, and I don't see them taking their foot off the gas. What's the odds that Hill and Waddle play 17 games each next year? I feel like he might have some standalone value in some games next year, and that's just a name to file away for later, not asking you to go rush out and draft him in the first round of your redraft leagues this year, but just something to file away and kind of keep in the back of your minds. Do you see that as a possibility for Berrios, and do you see him as a nice little fill-in for them if he needs to be?
He could be. He's not the same kind of player that the other two are. He's not the same kind of receiver. Like, he's more of a slot guy, but he absolutely could have a higher target share if one of those guys goes down, and that's not a bad pick to throw out there. I'm sure this is going to be added to your sleepers list as we get closer to the fantasy season and the regular season.
Absolutely. And just because he is a slot guy and the other two really aren't, I know the other two can play the slot, but they also are burners and they can run down the field. I feel like that gives him a leg up too, because he's filling a need of a position that they don't need to fill anymore. And they don't have that tight end over the middle right now, unless you can count their incumbent from last year.
Well, they could also draft one. Who knows at this point? But that tight end went to division rival Patriots.
Oh,
I know you are a big Mike Gesicki fan, and he is a little similar to Gronk. Not quite the same, but a little bit similar on the receiving side. I know when he was drafted, he was slightly compared to him as well. Do you think he actually can live up to part of Gronk's legacy in the Patriots, or what do you think the ceiling and floor is for him there?
So he's really lucky that he's not playing with Tom Brady, because I feel like there would be a lot more comparisons that you're drawing right now. And the fact that he's playing with Mac Jones kind of lets him carve his own legacy and his own path forward. They still do have Hunter Henry, who is aging a bit, and he did take a huge step back from his first year with Mac Jones to last year. And Gesicki took a big step back last year, but that's because they did not prioritize the tight end any longer. and they were looking at prioritizing the wide receiver target share in that offense and having the tight end block more. And that's why Gesicki didn't really fit into there, and it didn't really make sense to franchise tag him last year for Miami. Like, it felt like a wasted cap hit for them. But I love his pass catching ability, and I love his straight line speed, and I think that is exactly what Mac Jones needs in this offense. A big target over the middle, but we'll see it. I think the jury is still out on whether Mac Jones can capitalize on that or not. I do think there's a legitimate question who the tight end one in New England is with Gesicki and Henry. Obviously, there's probably a slight leg up to Henry because he's the incumbent there, but I could easily see Gesicki passing him in training camps and in OTAs and even in the preseason. I could even see Hunter Henry being a cap casualty or a roster cut towards the end of the year. He just hasn't really lived up to the hype there. And I know they spent like a fortune on tight ends that offseason. Do you kind of agree with that? It's kind of what Mac Jones needs as a weapon.
Yeah, I pretty much agree with everything you said. I have liked Gesicki as well, and I was very annoyed they stopped using him once they got Tyreek Hill. Like, I get you want to use Hill. That's totally fine. That's what you went out and got him for. He's exceptional. He brings something that Gesicki doesn't. But Gesicki would have been a good third option for them, but they decided to move on. I think the Patriots, they tried to get a good tight end. They tried to have two good tight ends, and Jonnu Smith and Henry, and neither one of them has worked out. I've never been a Henry fan. I liked Jonnu Smith's athleticism, and Jonnu Smith was pretty good on the Titans, so it's been very disappointing, his tenure with New England, so hopefully he turns it around with the Falcons. But I've never been a fan of Hunter Henry. I've always thought he was overrated. I could easily see him being a cap casualty if he doesn't leave behind too much dead cap. And I could see Gesicki passing him up. I know that they like signing division rivals, especially receiving options from Miami, because they already have Parker on that team. In the past, they've got Wes Welker from the Dolphins too. So they definitely like poaching from their division rivals. I could see Gesicki. I could see Juju Smith-Schuster. I could see Parker putting up a decent amount with Mac Jones now that they have an actual offensive coordinator. I don't know if I trust any of these guys to be anything close to a wide receiver one. Gesicki might be a low-end tight end one, maybe, but tight ends don't usually put up that much in general compared to wide receivers. They're improving the roster talent around Mac Jones, and I think they still, like some of these other teams, are going to add more receiving options. So it's hard for me to say what they produce now, but Gesicki looks like he's in the makings to return at least a tight end one value, meaning a starting tight end, not the number one tight end. But I like the move for them.
Absolutely. Another move that I think we both like is the Buffalo Bills snagging Damian Harris from those same New England Patriots. I think this is their first power back in several seasons, and he fills a need that isn't like Cook and Hines and Singletary, basically all the same back in the backfield. Like he provides a different skill set, and he may take away some touches, especially down close, from Josh Allen. So what do you think about the signing of Harris, and do you think that affects Josh Allen's fantasy stats? Do you feel like that affects Cook or Hines, or how do you see that backfield shaking out?
Well, I think if you're a Bills fan, you want Josh Allen to stop risking his body close to the goal line, and the hope would be Damian Harris to run it in himself. And like you mentioned, he's probably the first effective power back that they've had since Marshawn Lynch, probably. I don't know if there's someone in between that point, but I think he's a good complement, like you said, to Cook. Cook's that receiving kind of speedier back. Harris has still been an effective running back, even like with New England. It's another AFC East team poaching off a division rival. It was low cost move. I think this is really good for the Bills. I don't know fantasy wise. This is one of those other situations where there's two backs and which one are you going to take? I think Harris and Cook will probably be in the 7 or 8 round range when we get there. Maybe they'll move up to the 6th round. And I don't know which one I would take then. Hopefully you get to see some preseason action, or you get to hear about camp, which one's starting over the other in camp to kind of help figure it out. But if the price is reasonable, you could snag either Harris or Cook, and they could be a good contributor to your team. But it's a really good football move for the Bills for sure.
Yeah, I think it'll be reasonable on both Cook and Harris. I think more so with Harris. But I do have them both closer to flex plays than running backs that you're going to draft to be your starters. Harris may even be a guy that starts off on your bench, and if Cook went down, then you would be able to insert Harris into the lineup because I think that they would lean on him more without Cook there, and then sprinkle in Hines behind him. But I do think, like, we start game 1, snap 1, I do think James Cook is out next to Josh Allen, and I think it's time for the second-year running back to kind of take his next step forward. He did finish running back 44 on the season last year, so I do expect him to take at least a 10 spot jump this year, and I feel like that is a good second-year leap, especially when you have a power back that's so complimentary next to you in Damian Harris.
Well, there's a good chance that he wins out a camp battle and is the primary back, or game script wise, if they are stomping on another team, they might just hand the ball to him for the rest of the game. So there's a good chance that he could end up having more stats at the end of the season. So that's something to keep in mind. But I think Cook is going to be involved more in tight games, or if they ever get behind against another team.
Right, absolutely. And that's a good point, because when you hit the 2-minute drill, you kind of want that running back in fantasy. Oh, yeah. So speaking of speed help that used to be part of the Bills, now has joined the Colts. Isaiah McKenzie, who was just cut by the Bills last week, moves on to Indy. He provides them with a speedy wide receiver, but I think we both can agree that his fantasy value is kind of capped. And I think moving away from Josh Allen even caps that a little bit more. What is your fantasy outlook for Isaiah McKenzie?
Well, first of all, who's his quarterback going to be? We have no idea
Gardner
yet.
Minshew.
We don't know. Gardner Minshew, Jeff's hero out there. I like Gardner Minshew. I think he's kind of a gunslinger, so actually could be kind of good for Isaiah McKenzie, especially if there are a lot of negative game scripts. It could be Will Levis. It could be Anthony Richardson. We get to find out pretty soon who they draft, or if they pass on the position altogether, which would be interesting in itself and another thing to talk about at a future podcast. But okay, if Gardner Minshew starts for most of the year, I think Isaiah McKenzie might actually provide more value with Indy than he did at the Bills. Which is weird because Josh Allen is a much better quarterback, but it's just different tendencies. So maybe he outproduces where he likely goes in fantasy drafts, because there's no way he goes above like round 10 or round 11 in most fantasy drafts, Isaiah McKenzie.
Yeah,
so
absolutely. And he may be a guy that doesn't even get drafted. Mark my words, if Gardner Minshew starts the entire season, he will have over 4,000 passing yards. That is a guarantee even with that terrible receiving core, and I know they have Pittman and Pierce, but everything behind it is just McKenzie and a bunch of guys. So they could be someone that looks for receiver help kind of early on day 2. I do see that if Gardner Minshew, and I will stand by this, if Gardner Minshew starts all 17 games for the Colts, he will have over 4,000 passing yards. And there is a real chance that if they draft Anthony Richardson, who is being slotted in mock drafts right now, that Gardner Minshew would start the entire season just to give Anthony Richardson a full season of reps and vision and kind of get his mechanics right before he's starting to get slammed by NFL players to the ground.
Yeah, you'd hope they'd want to fix their offensive line too.
Yeah, and speaking of Buffalo Bills wide receivers, Jamison Crowder left Buffalo to go sign with the New York Giants. They also have a very loaded wide receiver room. So both New York wide receiver rooms are very jammed packed. They're going to have to expand them both inside of MetLife Stadium. Basically, do you see someone like Jamison Crowder making the roster? And if so, what is his fantasy impact?
Honestly, I don't think he has much of an impact even if he stays on the roster. I just don't, even in that wide receiver group, I don't see him in the starting 3. And I don't think that he's ultimately going to make it past training camp. So I don't know if that's a bold take, but I don't think Crowder has ever really lived up to his early career hype. And I think the Giants are probably going to take a wide receiver in the draft early. That's just my take.
Right. And I think because this has to be the year that you take the training wheels off of Daniel Jones. You don't pay a guy $40 a year to keep the training wheels on him and not unleash him into the world for better or for worse. So they need to figure out in the next 2 years if he's the guy or not, because there's a very easy out after 2 years. So they really need to make sure they're putting the guys that Daniel Jones has chemistry with on the field, guys that are productive on the field, and that was not Kenny Galladay. So there is that, but we don't know what that will look like, because I don't know if Daniel Jones has really had chemistry like that with somebody yet. Is there a wide receiver that comes to mind that he may have had really good chemistry with?
No. The closest would be Darius Slayton that was on the Giants. So
He's back too.
Was re-signed. That's about all that I can recall. So there is a chance they re-sign OBJ too. He might go to the Giants as well.
Right, absolutely. And we kind of want to round up our free agent signings, just mentioning that D'Ernest Johnson is moving on from the Cleveland Browns and signing with the Jacksonville Jaguars. Do you see him or Snoop Connor being the primary backup for ETN, or do you see them kind of splitting, or do you see it being kind of moot because ETN's going to be the guy?
I think it's kind of moot. ETN's going to be the guy. I know D'Ernest Johnson has been a popular name in fantasy circles for a long time as someone who's going to break out, and it just doesn't happen. But I think he has similar skill sets to ETN, so he is a good backup if something were to happen to ETN. I just don't think he's going to put up stats unless there's an ETN injury.
Yeah, and he was kind of buried in Cleveland, though, to be fair, behind Chubb and Hunt, which it's very surprising that Hunt doesn't have any visits yet, any suitors yet. Maybe his past is turning teams off, and also his talent level has dropped quite a bit. But Dearness, when he did play when Chubb and Hunt were out, he did produce in all of those games. So it's just a name to kind of keep an eye on. If anything happened to ETN, he would be a very nice 1 or 2 week starter, especially like bye week fill in. Like it's just stuff to start keeping an eye on for later in the season, not something to look at when you're doing drafts in August and September, but it's something to look at in like November, December, come fantasy championship time.
I agree.
So Alex, what is left in free agency? Like, if we go position by position here, what is left?
Well, at quarterback, it's kind of barren. We've got Wentz, and we've got Matt Ryan, Teddy Bridgewater, and just maybe Tom Brady might come back. I'm starting to think he might be really retired, trying to get his family life in order, but I don't know. The other guys on this list, do you think they have anything left to give? Do you think they could start? Or are they clipboard holders? Are they legitimate backups? What do you think of Wentz, Ryan, Bridgewater?
So I'm leaning your way with Tom Brady slightly now. It's really hard to fully buy into his retirement, but I'm getting closer and closer to doing it. But we know as soon as I buy into his retirement, it's the day that he comes out of it. Because I did remove him from all of my spreadsheets last year, and it feels like the very next day he unretired. So he's not removed from my spreadsheets yet. But I know the day that I remove him is the day that he's going to come back, or at least the day before he comes back. Bridgewater's nothing more than a glorified backup at this point, and we're going to see what team is going to really look into him. It doesn't really even seem like very many teams are interested in him, which is, I don't know, might behoove him to sit on the sidelines until there's an injury and go to a better landing spot for him. If we look at Matt Ryan, I think that Matt Ryan retires. And if we look at Carson Wentz, I love Carson Wentz. I think he's the ideal stature, arm strength for an NFL quarterback. For whatever reason, after the ACL tear, it just didn't work out. And it's one of those cases of what always could have been, because he was having an MVP season during that ACL tear. So it's not like the talent was never there. There was pre-ACL and post-ACL, and they've been completely two different quarterbacks. They've been so different that they had to move on from him to a very unproven Jalen Hurts, which actually worked out very well for them, but they didn't know that was going to work out well for them. There's pretty much a wasteland of quarterbacks right now, and I do expect a plethora of quarterbacks to go in the first round of the rookie draft coming up in 5 weeks, as we had mentioned. Second round quarterbacks, maybe third round quarterbacks. I do expect a whole handful of them to go, because there's just not anything on the market right now. Who knows? There could even be a few trades, because we know San Fran has 3 quarterbacks right now, and we know one of them is more for Brock Purdy, just to make sure that he's going to be good with his UCL injury. All these injuries with the CLs after the end of it.
Yeah.
And that just happens to be a baseball pitcher injury, which very few NFL quarterbacks have had a UCL injury. And we've had 2 this last year with Josh Allen and then Brock Purdy. Josh Allen didn't need surgery. He rehabbed it, and Brock Purdy needed surgery. But moving on to running backs, we have Zeke Elliott. We have Playoff Lenny, Lombardi Lenny, whatever you want to call him these days. We have McKinnon. We have the aforementioned Kareem Hunt. And we have Melvin Gordon available. There's some big names on this list. Do you see any of the big names signing? Do you see any of them signing with a team anytime soon?
I think at this point, maybe 1 or 2 of them sign with the team maybe before the draft, but a lot of them are veterans. they could sign with the team during camp or after the draft. They maybe missed out on the running backs that they wanted. They could ultimately sign with the team once there's an injury that happens, or if they cut somebody else. A lot of these guys can still contribute. They can still provide something. I think Gordon probably has the least in the tank of the ones that you mentioned. It's to be determined about Elliott. I think a lot of people are 50-50. A lot of people think he's still got something. I think personally that he's been run down, so I don't know how much he has left. But Fournette has been very serviceable. He can at least be a top backup somewhere. McKinnon was very serviceable in Kansas City, and even with Pacheco exploding a little bit this season, like coming out, I think McKinnon still would provide them a lot of value. So I'm a little surprised they haven't re-signed him. Hunt, I don't know why he hasn't had any news yet. I don't know if he's gotten in trouble and we just haven't heard about it, or if teams think that he's washed up, or if there's personality issues. Ultimately, when it comes to the field, I think these guys should be signed.
Yeah, absolutely. As you had mentioned, I don't see how McKinnon isn't back with the Chiefs. It's a lot of pass catches, a lot of targets that Mahomes would be losing with Hardman and Juju and McKinnon leaving. At some point, all of this turnover is going to catch up to Mahomes. Like, I'm not saying that he's going to drop down to be a bottom half of the league quarterback, but at some point, these have to really affect him, and like he can't just keep rolling like it's nothing every year. Because at some point, like you need some chemistry going into the year, like because Kelsey's not going to play forever, although we all want him to.
He is a god.
But yeah, I see McKinnon probably signing first, and the rest are just like huge names that people may want to stay away from because they feel like they would be the chirpers in the room to want a bigger piece of the pie than the team is willing to offer them. If Zeke or if playoff Lenny or if Kareem Hunt aren't willing to be role players, then they may be out of the league. Sad.
Yeah, but a lot of these teams still need wide receiver help, and we've got some wide receivers out there. We've got Chark and Marvin Jones, Odell Beckham, who we've mentioned, Jarvis Landry's out there. There's some interesting guys that still haven't signed.
You do know where Beckham goes, Landry's going to follow. So if he goes to the Jets, that wide receiver room gets a little bit more packed.
There's no way. There's no way.
I mean, there's teams like the Titans that need wide receiver help. They just need someone. They need players to eat up targets and productive targets. And any one of these players that we had mentioned would be really good at eating up targets. If Landry wants to continue his playing career, I could easily see him fitting into Tennessee for a season. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Landry started his career playing with Ryan Tannehill.
He did in Miami.
Yep. That is interesting that I just didn't think about until just now. And that epiphany makes all the sense in the world. If Landry is going to continue his playing career, there's a need, there's chemistry. And I don't think he left Miami because of Tannehill. I would have to go back and research why he wanted out of Miami, but I'll have to go back and research that. But if there wasn't any issues, then that's a perfect spot for him. I also don't understand why Marvin Jones, who's been like a very under-the-radar target share monster, why he hasn't been talked about more. He's very consistent year over year. I don't know if you've noticed that, but just looking at stats and looking at my spreadsheets and such, like he's just a very consistent player year over year, and he's someone that's going to produce year over year as well. And it'll be really interesting to see who kicks the tires on him and who takes that risk on him, because he's in the last 3 years, he's finished as high as wide receiver 17. And his lowest year was wide receiver 57. So that's a very rosterable player. If you think about the top, so if he finished at worst wide receiver 57 the last 3 years, and you think that there's 64 at minimum starting wide receivers in the NFL, he's at minimum a starting wide receiver in the NFL. It's just puzzling that he's not getting more offers and more looks, but that could be something that comes after the draft, because I do know a lot of teams like to shift their focus to the draft after the first couple of weeks of free agency, and they really want to look at the young, cheap talent that's coming out of the draft and team controllable talent for 4 or 5 years. And then you have Marvin Jones, on the other hand, who just turned 33, but he was wide receiver 57 in his age 32 season. So I just don't see the drop off that maybe other folks do, but he's just an interesting name to look at. And he could be a target monster. He could average about 60 targets or 60 catches.
Yeah, I think he's at minimum a wide receiver 3 on most teams in the league. I'm a little flabbergasted why he hasn't gotten any mention. Not even in the Twitter sphere has he been mentioned, as far as I can tell.
Yeah.
Whereas everyone's focused on OBJ and Chark.
Yeah, and I think we both can agree that both Chark and OBJ will probably be signed pre-draft.
Most likely.
Can't wait for that to come to an end, especially the OBJ saga.
Yeah. There are a couple tight ends. I know this is a very tight end heavy draft, but there are a couple tight ends out there that are still available. Both of them have had injury concerns lately. So there's Irv Smith and Cameron Brate. Do you think Cameron Brate is done with football, or do you think he comes back for a team? And does Irv Smith sign with someone?
Yeah, I was trying to compute there really quickly, because Cameron Brate's older than we think he is. He's been in the league 9 years, and he's 31. He'll be 32 before the season starts. So, that doesn't really compute with a team rushing to sign him. And I guess, the same could be said for Kyle Rudolph, who will be 34 in season. He might be done. He's coming from the same Tampa Bay Buccaneers that Brate is. But what really interests me is Irv Smith. He has 4 years into the NFL. He's 24 years old. He'll be 25 before the season starts. I know he has a bit of an injury history, but there's nothing that screams recurring injury to him either. And there's so many tight end needy teams that I think it would be a mistake for teams to wait until after the draft to sign and bring in Irv Smith. I think he's a guy that needs to be brought in and signed now. Any fits you see?
I think he could potentially re-sign with Minnesota. So that could be a decent spot for him.
They did bring in Josh Oliver.
I would have thought the Giants, but they just traded for Waller. The Raiders just signed 2 tight ends. The Pats just signed a tight end.
What about with Joe Burrow?
That's true. Could go to the Bengals maybe for a cheap 1-year deal. So that might be something, and allow them to use their draft capital on another position.
If I'm the Bengals, though, I'm throwing a 3-year deal at him for a little bit more money because he's 24. I would want him to build chemistry with Burrow. So, instead of giving him a 1-year $5 million, I would do a 3-year $18 million. So give him an extra $1 million a year over 3 years.
I would make the first year the only guaranteed money. I wouldn't put any guaranteed money in the other 2 years.
Yep. But I could see them trying to finagle him to stay, because there's a chance that he sees that whole contract if he signs that, because he's so young, and he would have Joe Burrow throwing him the ball. So I don't know. Let's manifest this into the ether and get Irv Smith, and a productive Irv Smith, over to Cincinnati, because I just think that he makes that offense a little bit better. And we do know that Joe Burrow does like his tight ends, and they really have not addressed that at all. They They let Drew Sample go, who's still a free agent, and they let Hayden Hurst go, who is now a Carolina Panther. So that is the free agent recap. As you can see, there is not a ton left out there. We are thoroughly through our first wave of free agency and a little bit into the second wave of free agency, because you can see lower names go now. There's not going to be very many more big names flying in free agency. There is one big name, OBJ, who we did mention that was looking for 20 a season. He did correct the report that he was looking for 20 a season, saying that he wanted more than 4. There's conflicting reports that he started out looking for 20 and he was starting being offered 4. So I'm sure the story lies somewhere in the middle, but I think OBJ definitely is worth more than 4 per season, but definitely not worth 20 per season, just based on what other wide receivers in that range are signing for. I think he's worth more than Mecole Hardman at this point in his career. What say you about OBJ? Like, do you think that he finally can hammer out a deal this week, and we can stop talking about when he's going to sign and talking about what he can do to the team that he signs with?
I think, yeah, he's probably going to sign before the draft, as we've mentioned previously, but it's most likely going to be a 1-year deal, maybe worth as much as $15 million with incentives. So the cap figure is probably going to be like $7 or $8 million, maybe. That makes it kind of hard for the Jets, in my opinion, but I can't see any team wanting to sign him for more than 1 year at this point. He's missed approximately like 51 games in his career. So that's quite a lot of games. He does still have a lot of upside to provide, and he's very talented. So a number of teams are interested, but no one was going to give him close to $20 million a year. I think ultimately they tried to entice him with a 1-year deal, and if he proves it, then he'll get a longer contract.
Yeah, absolutely. And I could see a multi-year contract just to spread out the cap hit over a few years. But that's just what teams do to try to spread out the cap hit. And that kind of happened a little bit with Aaron Rodgers. What is going on? Speaking of Aaron Rodgers, what is going on with him? And who the heck has the leverage here?
So clearly the teams are playing chicken. Both Green Bay and the Jets both think that they have the leverage. But in my opinion, the longer Green Bay holds on to Aaron Rodgers, the less valuable he is, the most capital they can get for him drops. The Jets at some point could get frustrated and say, sorry, we're going to try to draft a quarterback in the draft. We're picking at 13. We have 2 second-round picks. We can potentially trade up to get one of these quarterbacks if they slide a little bit, or if we strike out, we can just go after Lamar Jackson after the draft. They're also the only team that's interested in Aaron Rodgers as far as we know. So the Packers really have no choice. They're not going to eat $60 million and pay him and go through the public humiliation of everybody knowing that they wanted to move on and Rodgers coming back into training camp with them. It's just not going to happen. And they might want something in this upcoming draft rather than waiting for next year's compensation. So it behooves them to maybe lower their asking price and get a deal done now.
Absolutely. And I feel like there has to be some sort of comp pick on the back end to kind of, if Rodgers wins an MVP, if they win a Super Bowl, if he plays a second year, like there has to be some sort of not comp pick, but a conditional pick based on Rodgers. Like if he only plays 1 year, I don't think Green Bay should walk away with multiple things out of this. And I know Green Bay is going to ask for the world. at the end of the day, Rodgers isn't going to let Green Bay off the hook of the $60 million. He will show up and he will try to start, and he'll make their life miserable. But as you had mentioned, and I'm hoping the Rodgers thing is cleared up in the next few weeks. What I don't think will be cleared up in the next few weeks is what you mentioned, Lamar Jackson. The Jets could look for Lamar Jackson after the draft. So who else do you see that could make an offer for Lamar Jackson? And when do you see them being able to make that offer?
Well, I know that team-wise, we've talked about a few times that the Commanders would make a lot of sense roster-wise and location-wise for Lamar Jackson because he wouldn't have to move. He'd be basically in the same area. And they have good wide receivers. They have a couple running backs that are pretty decent. They have a defense that's fairly decent. That would be a good spot for him. But as far as I can tell, Dan Snyder is in debt and on his way out. They would probably have to be bought and by a very wealthy owner for that to happen. But it could happen probably after the draft. The Colts we've talked about as also being an option for them. We both know that they're not going to give up the 4th overall pick. They have a chance to get a young quarterback for cheap for that price on a 5-year deal. So that wouldn't make sense if they miss out on their favorite quarterback and they don't feel like there's a one that's worth that pick. Then maybe after the draft. We've also talked about the Falcons before, that they might come back after the draft as well because they do pick at 8. They do have a chance to get someone like Anthony Richardson. So those are the 3 teams. I don't know if you want to elaborate on any of those as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Like as you said, after the sale with the Commanders, and I don't see a benefit in a team giving up a 2023 pick when they can they can make that pick and then offer up their 24 and 25 picks. I just don't see a benefit, like especially teams like the Colts that you said were picking really high. There is no benefit to the Colts visiting this until after the draft. There's no benefit to the Falcons visiting this until after the draft, because if they did snag Lamar from Baltimore, say Baltimore doesn't match, and Lamar starts a whole season for one of those teams, that pick is probably not going to be as high as it is this year. So if that draft pick falls, and plus a year later, that draft capital is a lot lower to get Lamar Jackson. And that is kind of what I see as a window for a team to make an offer sheet on Lamar Jackson. Now, maybe they'll make the offer sheet to his fake agent and it'll be nullified. And I totally say that tongue in cheek because I really don't know what's going on. But it's really funny that the NFL and Lamar just keep kind of poking at each other, kind of prodding at each other. It's kind of like as the world turns in the NFL. But another team that we didn't mention that I kind of want to throw out there is Lamar Jackson. Say that the Tennessee Titans make a offer sheet at him, especially with Tannehill kind of in the downside of his career. They have Derrick Henry. That rushing attack could be nasty with the two of them. That would just open up so many holes for both Lamar and for Derrick Henry. It'd be really fun to watch. They almost have like a version of the Wildcat that's never been seen before. Like you'd have a power guy and a speed quarterback that could throw the ball still. It'd just be, and Burks would be interesting. And I believe they have a 2nd-year tight end that would take a step forward. What do you make of his fake agent story? And do you feel like it's as crazy as I feel like it is?
I think Ken Francis might be a real person. I don't know if Ken Francis has any actual connection to Lamar Jackson whatsoever. So
he's my agent.
There's a possibility that there is someone named Ken Francis who did reach out to NFL teams, but he may not actually be affiliated with Lamar Jackson. So both of them could be right.
So there was a report that Lamar's doing commercials for him, for like a workout system or machine or something along those lines. But I don't know if that is enough to connect the dots to him reaching out to the NFL on Lamar's behalf as well.
Yeah, I mean, maybe he was trying to sell a commercial or something, or trying to get approval to have the NFL logo or something involved.
Right.
But
the interesting thing is Lamar's not signed to a team right now. Until he signs that franchise tag tender, he's technically not signed to an NFL team. He can pretty much do whatever he wants to do. So he's essentially free from the obligations of an NFL player. Like if he wanted to go do dangerous activities right now, like he's allowed to do that because the team can't dictate what he can and can't do if he hasn't signed the franchise tag. So it's just kind of interesting. Like he could probably do endorsements that the team doesn't completely support or anything like that as well.
I just think it's hilarious. But why would you put yourself in the position where you don't have an agent? He's already disadvantaged himself with the early negotiating window. He's made himself seem like he's hard to deal with. He may not be. He may be perfectly fine. But the way that it's been presented makes it look like he's difficult to deal with. And as far as we know, he hasn't come down from his fully guaranteed stance. But again, he doesn't have an agent. An agent would have taken care of all the media aspect. They would have been negotiating with teams already. I think he shot himself in the foot, and he can get upset about how he thinks the league is treating him. For all we know, this was an innocent mix-up on both parts.
That's what makes it funny.
But, yeah, I don't want to be the guy that reads into some of this stuff in the worst light. I'm sure we can have another podcast where we could absolutely go into like crazy conspiracy stuff, but that's not this podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's reel it in a bit and get back to some fantasy football potential news. And it looks like the Broncos are looking to deal one or both of their top two wide receivers. That is really interesting because this is just coming off of Sutton being signed a year ago to an extension, and also Judy was I believe a first or a second round pick for them. So what do you think the Broncos are moving towards, and then who do you see as being potential suitors for these wide receivers? Because Cleveland was one of them and is no longer one of them.
I think they just don't want to pay Judy. So Judy's likely the one that's traded. They've already paid Sutton. I think that's harder to get out of. I also like Sutton more. He definitely would be someone I would assume that they would keep for both of those reasons because, my likes matter apparently. But they were asking for too much for Judy, clearly, because Cleveland pivoted and went after Moore, and it was way cheaper. They just swapped a second for a third and more and got him, whereas the reported asking price for Judy is a first plus some. I don't know if they find someone who bites on that. He's the more likely one to move, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. There's rumors out there that the Cowboys nearly traded for Judy before Cooks. It does seem like teams are looking at the less expensive options of Judy. It could actually end up driving Judy's costs down. I know teams like the Patriots. I've seen like teams like the Bills being attached to him. I do know that it's not a huge deal with a wide receiver, but I do know teams do prefer to trade talent, especially star talent, out of the conference because they don't ever want to be competing against that star talent in like a for a playoff spot, or they don't ever want to have egg on their face because they gave that asset to a contending team that they're competing with, and they lose out to it because of that asset. They never want to be like that because that's the first and most sure way to get fired as a executive in the NFL. Sutton might have to stick on then if Judy goes, because I don't know if I see them both going. Like, and I know some of the Broncos beat has said that it's when and not if one of them goes, and maybe both of them. So I'm like, oh, great. I don't know what that looks like. And if they're doing this, what does this say about Russ? In a roundabout way, they like built this like perfect offense around Russ, and now they're like, oh, let's tear it down and redo it and make it a different way.
Was it perfect though? Because they had a train wreck of a season last year.
They thought it was.
I don't know, but it's very strange to come in and immediately tear down the wide receiver group and just only add a bunch of running backs.
Agreed.
Their offseason doesn't make any sense. I can't believe they traded picks for Sean Payton. Just everything about this offseason doesn't make sense for the Broncos now. So I don't know what they're doing. I don't expect them to have a good year at this point if they get rid of these guys. I don't know who they're going to get to replace them. Who are you going to get in the second or third round that potentially is going to put up more for you at the wide receiver level than Sutton or Judy? I don't see it.
Yeah, there could be a lot of wide receiver deals on the way, and they could happen during the draft. It happened with A.J. Brown last year, so don't count that out. That always makes it interesting, fun, exciting. We will see kind of what it brings, because you have Hopkins that could be on the move. You have Judy that could be on the move. You have Mike Evans that nobody's really talking about, but I don't think he fits with Baker. Could be on the move because he's old and expensive, and they're trying to get cheaper. Because I just even cut Ryan Suckup today. Also, you could have T. Higgins on the move still. I know we haven't talked about him in a few weeks, but I haven't heard any movement on his contract yet, and you would think they would want to get him locked sooner rather than later, or trade him. So he could be that next A.J. Brown mid-draft, and all of a sudden in the first round we're like, oh, T. Higgins is part of the Giants, part of the Bears. Whoa.
I mean, maybe trade one of these Broncos wide receivers for T. Higgins.
Right? Because I think the Broncos could afford to pay T.
It would improve the number one wide receiver spot for the Broncos, and would also give the Bengals a more affordable wide receiver too.
Yeah. That would be interesting.
But who knows? Yeah.
Something to think about. Sutton to think about.
All right. Well, Jeff just killed the mood for everybody. So that does it for another episode of the Never Too Early Fantasy Podcast, episode number 3. Thanks, everyone, for listening. Please download, like, and subscribe, and please share the show. Every little bit helps.
As always, you can find us with our handle N2EFantasy on Spotify, YouTube, TikTok, and Twitter. Please give us a follow, and until next time, take care of yourself, and remember, it's never truly too early for fantasy football. Thank you again.
Thanks, everybody.